The question I want to answer for us all in this room or this theatre tonight is, what can we do? That's the question. What can we do? You say, well, about what? Well, about the pressing moral issues of our time, the cultural shifts of our time, and how they affect us, especially as Christians. And I come armed this evening with something of an autopsy of Western Australia, which may depress you a little bit, but then I hope to inspire you by explaining what we can do in times like these. You've already heard a number of things from Peter, so I'll try not to rehearse too much of what he has already said. But let me go to this area first, something I have experience with. Some of you may not know that I was involved in the establishment of the Human Rights Law Alliance, which is a law firm which is dedicated to helping people who get in trouble with the law for living out their faith. Most people screw their face up at that point and say, surely that's not necessary. The truth is, it's actually a very busy firm. It's a very busy practice, and we've got a lot of cases even when I was running it. It's actually now run by a West Australian, a guy called John Steenhoff, who's doing a great job, and he is busy. They helped us, of course, when the West Australian state government said that we weren't welcome in their venues, on the basis that our views don't accord with the views of the WA state government or with the vast majority of Western Australians. It's an interesting point that, I thought, what is the mindset of somebody who writes that policy and thinks that's a good idea? It's never occurred to me that I would want to cancel events that disagree with me. It's never occurred to me that I'd want to disrupt or cause trouble for an event that disagrees with me. It's never occurred to me that I would want one monolithic view of the world only to ever be present in a society. That mindset is not a democratic mindset. That mindset is not a liberty mindset. The mindset of the person who wrote that and thought it was a good idea is a totalitarian mindset. And I think, well, people write that down and think it's a good idea. Such are the days in which we live. But see, we actually, when we were designing this tour, we said there will come a time when we have these difficulties. We got through Queensland really well, but we knew we would have difficulties. We knew people would gum up our ticketing system. We knew that all that sort of stuff would happen, and it did. And so we're ready for it because we've been dealing with a lot of this sort of thing in recent years. The Alliance helped a number of people who actually face some of these challenges and worse. And when I go through these sorts of cases, a lot of people turn around to me and they say, oh, now you're just trying to play the victim. Because there is, I think, in the cultural climate in which we live, a lot of currency in becoming a victim and saying, well, we're a victim, therefore. Well, no, I just want to say to every Christian in the room, Christians are never victims. Never. They can't be victims because Jesus died for us. And so there is not one single thing of ultimate meaning and lasting value that we've been denied. We're going to talk a bit about Job this evening, believe it or not, in a context that will surprise you. It's all right. We're not going to go too far down into the depths. But, with Job, he lost everything. And he said at the start, the Lord gives and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. But see, what he actually also said in Job 19 was that actually he'd lost nothing. What had God really taken away from him? Only the temporal and the material, because he said, I know my Redeemer lives, and he shall stand on the earth in the last day. And even though my skin will be destroyed, so even though I'm going to die, yet in my flesh I'll see God. There's a lot of New Testament theology in that. Jesus rose and he'll raise all of us back to new life. There is another world. There is another life. Job knew he'd lost nothing. And that's true for every Christian. We are never victims, and we must never have a victim mentality. In fact, the problem, Jesus actually became the victim for us. And so I make that proviso before I start to just talk about some true stories. Let's not go into a victim mindset, but let's appreciate the true stories. The first one relates to a couple here in WA, and I'm only going to use WA cases. The couple in WA is Byron and Kira, is their names, and they applied to become foster parents through the foster parenting system. And they applied to be respite carers for children under the age of 5 years, on weekends and things when they're between foster care situations. And Byron and Kira passed every single criteria with flying colours. I've read all of the documentation. Man, they did well. Until they had to fill out a survey, a questionnaire on what their convictions were around issues of sexual orientation and gender identity. Now, these folk are Christians, and they filled that out faithfully. Of course, what is the Christian view on the subject? Well, it is that human beings have many desires, Human beings have many things that they come up with in their mind and how they feel, and that come from within, that come from even their identity, which define how they want to behave in certain ways around sexuality, gender identity, everything. But actually, ever since the creation of the world, God has simply designed the world such that there is a male and there's a female, ever since creation, and that the male and the female are meant for each other, and they're to marry to the exclusion of all others for life. And the Christian believe that that's God's will. And that is God's will for our good, and we follow it. Each of us has to make that decision in our lives. Now that's the view that they have, but of course Byron and Kira not only sort of made that clear, they said at the same time, we've asked to be respite carers for children under the age of 5. It's not relevant, surely, and it's short term. And by the way, in foster care, there is a system in place whereby the suitability of a home is assessed before a child is placed. And so, of course, if there was an issue there, then, of course, they wouldn't be deemed suitable. And so that child wouldn't be placed with them. Interestingly, right after they filled out that survey, they were told that they were not permitted to become foster parents because their home was not safe for children. That's not the only case of that kind. That's in WA. Another case is one of a guy, Ian is his name, he's a school teacher, he lives in WA. And Ian posted on a Facebook community notice board. This was actually back when the same-sex marriage debate was happening. And a lot of people were posting on there explaining why they were voting in favour of that policy change. And he posted on there in a very reasonable way. There was no nastiness to what he said, but he posted on there why he was going to be voting no. And he was reported to the education authorities, and he was stood down under disciplinary action by the education department. He also, the local ABC radio, drummed up some stories on him and got some of his former pupils on there to badmouth him. And then they came after his status as a foster carer, and he had foster children. And so Ian went through that not once, but twice, because when he got legal help and he got through it, then they came back and had another bite at the cherry. That often happens, unfortunately. Another story is that of Jason. He's a Perth-based photographer, and an old friend of his got in touch with him through Facebook and said, I see you're a photographer, would you take photos for me? In the course of his dealings with his old friend, he was telling his old friend about his Christian faith. And he told his friend about his Christian faith, and the issue of her lesbian identity came up. And he explained to her what his beliefs around that were, much in the same fashion as I kind of did just before. But then he, made it very clear that this was not an issue, that he's very happy to take photos, he's very happy to, be on contract with her. But nonetheless, she did take Jason to the Equal Opportunity Commission, because she said that because of the way he expressed himself, he had put a condition on the provision of that service in such a way that it was a detriment to her on the basis of her sexual orientation. Now, that case was dropped when it came out with much publicity at the State Administrative Tribunal. But those are the sorts of things that are going on a lot now. And it is always on these hot-button, contested cultural issues of our time. And we're seeing people losing professional accreditations. We've seen the medical board, in a very activist way, pursue a lot of people. We are seeing people, we saw a guy drummed out of his university. We're seeing people under workplace discipline, HR departments, all this kind of stuff. This is the work of HRLA. This is sort of our world. The thing is, this is, well, I say it's part of our world. I'm actually the subject of a complaint as well at the moment. So I'm off to the Queensland Human Rights Commission later in September, because some people have been watching the truth of it and have lodged complaints against me. And so I'm under legal process. Anyway, that's a whole other story. So this is sort of situation normal very much, and it's very, very real for me at the moment. The legal mechanisms that enable this are actually getting stronger, not weaker. Peter told you about the conversion therapy legislation. Dreadful name. Because the reason it's named that, frankly, is so that people can't oppose it, because it sounds so horrible to say, well, I'm opposing legislation that's banning conversion therapy. Well, let's be clear. Conversion therapy is wrong. That kind of thing isn't happening in churches in this state. And in fact, it's actually a bit of a dog whistle where people get the idea that Christians would do that. Of course they wouldn't do that. Of course it hasn't happened for decades. However, that legislation goes so far that we've got to draw a line somewhere. And Peter took you through some of those scenarios. It reaches into the family home. It reaches into, well, you know, a lot of doctors these days, if a child, for example, has gender dysphoria, there's not one correct way to treat a child with gender dysphoria. There can't be. You've got to get to the cause of the gender dysphoria first and find out whether or not you go down the hormones path and then further on, or whether you take a different avenue. Of course, that's just good medicine. But no doctor or counsellor in Victoria is going to be foolish enough to not affirm the stated identity and feelings of a patient, because it is legally fraught. And Peter did say 10 years in jail. The reality is that there's two possibilities, 5 years or 10 years. And it's not over the top to say that that jail term could fall, say, on a parent. I mean, actually, their neighbour could dob them in. There is a reporting mechanism where the neighbour could dob them in. But it's not fanciful to say that that could fall on a parent, because what needs to be established is harm. And that could be temporary mental discomfort. And someone could allege that later on. And so the legislation goes way too far. And it is more scaffolding on which these complaints can be lodged. And of course, we deal with it very often. There's also some social policy issues that Christians increasingly can't opt out of on conscientious grounds. There's a story of a guy in Victoria, and he had a couple come to him, and they were seeking, he was a doctor, they were seeking a late-term abortion, so a viable child that could be born and could live, a late-term abortion, because the child was a female. And he actually rang the medical board to say that this had happened to him, and said, you know, surely this is wrong, surely this has got to be somehow against the law. And they actually didn't go after the couple that wanted the abortion because the child was a girl, they went after him. Because he had declined to provide the abortion, and he had declined to refer the couple to someone who definitely would provide the abortion, which the law requires. And of course, it doesn't really get anyone out on conscientious grounds. The conscience is simply not respected. It's the same in WA here. You've just had the euthanasia law pass, and there's a lot of Christian doctors, and there are Christian, like Catholic medical institutions and stuff, who say, well, I can't kill someone. I just can't do it. And it's the same with the medical institutions. They say, well, we can't provide killing on our premises. That is not, I mean, you can't, just in case anyone needs clarification, it is wrong to do that, to assist somebody to commit suicide. It is wrong. You just can't, you do everything you can to alleviate suffering and pain, and that can be done through palliative processes. And all these health institutions will do that, but they won't kill. But of course, the euthanasia legislation says, no, you have to give the information package to the individual so that they can get the service. Well, you know, it's not that far away. You know, you still have to be complicit. The conscience is not respected. Now, I say all of that, and it's almost my specialty a bit to get people a bit depressed about the state of things, and you will notice that it's funny. I actually did that once in an audience, and I said, but there's hope. And this poor bloke on the front row goes, oh! But now that you're there, I actually want to take us back to those were basically all WA examples too, which I was careful to give. Now that you're there, I just want to take us back to this question, what can we do? What can we do? Okay, we've got to answer that. And the answer is, at first, it depends to some degree. Because there's two kinds of problems, and they demand two kinds of answers. One kind of problem is the kind of problem that you can actually do something about. All right? We can actually respond, and you can action in the face of it, take action in the face of it. There's another kind of problem which you can do nothing about. And you need to distinguish between those two. Because if you vex your soul over the things which you can do nothing about, and you let them dominate you and weigh you down, you will lose your peace. You will lose your joy. You'll be defeated, and you'll be a ball of misery and anxiety. Do you know, we need to keep those things in perspective. And I do think that one of the big issues at the moment, actually, is the COVID thing in that regard. There is something big, and here in Geraldton in WA, I appreciate it's not the same. I have a lot of staff living in lockdown at the moment, and you can tell on the phone to them that they're in lockdown. I actually had a friend recently confess to me, I never would have imagined, this blew me away, But because of the whole COVID stuff, he actually was one of the people that rang Lifeline because he became suicidal. And he says never anything like that happened to him before. In fact, Lifeline got 3,345 calls in a single day last week from people on the East Coast. And people ring Lifeline because they're suicidal. This is very much lockdown-induced. Now, people get very stressed about the virus and the lethality of the virus. That's a big issue. And people are afraid. And I do think that's why the premiers can do whatever they want, because people are afraid. Can I just say Christians should lead the way in not being afraid? That's something that's just been on my mind lately. You know, fear of death is a condition from which Christ has freed us. Hebrews 2:15, right? That he might free those who all their lives were subject to the slavery of the fear of death. I actually read an incredible story from 180 AD written by the Bishop of Carthage. And in 180 AD, it was the close of the Antonine Plague in Rome, one of two plagues in Rome. And during the Antonine Plague, things had got so bad that the chief physician of the Roman Empire, a guy called Galen, had fled to his country estate to sort of stay, you know, a bit like we fled to WA, to sort of hide out while it was going on. It was a lot more serious back then. I mean, people were dying and getting sick in droves. And what happened typically to the dying were that they would be thrown out of their homes or they would be deserted because the plague was so bad, so the likelihood of death was so high. But the Bishop of Carthage wrote that the Christians in that era were moving into the cities and seeking out those who had been abandoned and who were dying. And he said that actually, here's one of the things about medical science at the time. They thought that if you went in to minister to someone and help them, and they lived, but you got the plague and died, they believed that you had transferred the plague to yourself. You'd sucked it out of them, and it had come onto you, and you died in their stead. So they believed they were all going to be martyrs. And they said, better that we die, because we know where we're going. We know our destiny, than for them to die. And so they went and ministered to people. And the Bishop of Carthage said, this plague has been, he said, it's been terrible in so many ways, but he said, in this respect, it has been very good. It has taught us not to fear death. And I looked at that, and I looked at today, and I went, something doesn't add up. Something doesn't add up. We should lead the way in not fearing. But there is also the fear of the response. A lot of people are afraid of the government, afraid of the restrictions, afraid of the level of enforcement, afraid of the vaccine and these kinds of things. And I honestly appreciate all of that. I'm not degrading any of it. What I want to say is there's something about the COVID situation that's big, that's global, and that's out of our control. And it will go for as long as it goes. And it's things like that that fall into the category of things that you can do nothing about. I also think that in the short term, and probably the medium term, there's very little we can do about the broad cultural trend of our time. That kind of totalitarian control trend is very, very strong right now in a lot of areas. Rod Dreher has written a great book called Live Not by Lies, which documents this. And basically he points out how that in the name of harm reduction and safety, there is totalitarian power being exercised on every hand. All things are being brought under, all things are being prohibited in the name of whatever it takes to preserve safety. You see that in the conversion therapy legislation. Someone could be harmed by what you say. So preacher, you can't speak in the pulpit. Family home, you can't look after your kids in the way you want to, blah, 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 blah. Why? Harm reduction, safety. You see it also in so-called hate speech laws. I did a segment on that in Albany, which will come out. Hate and speech, they're two different things, by the way. Hate's in the heart, it's a motive. Speech is something different. Speech is called disagreement. It's called the beginning of a debate. Let's talk about it and convince each other. But, of course, they say, no, free speech is risky speech. Right? If you're free to speak, you can say things that make people feel bad. And therefore, totalitarian control, shut it down, end it, and do what it takes. Take people to human rights commissions, that's where I'm going, for saying things like I'm saying tonight. They call it therapeutic totalitarianism. It's a very interesting trend. But anyway, I'll go on that. The fact is, these are things we cannot control in a very key respect. And so we need to understand how to react to those firstly. I think Job helps us to understand how to react to those and think about those things, believe it or not. Because he was a man who had a lot of things happen to him that were outside of his control. in a big way. Now, they weren't just threatening things. They weren't just things that were upsetting him and concerning him. They were things that affected him deeply and personally in a remarkable way. And in Job's case, you see where there's this meeting of Satan and God in heaven. It's quite a strange opening chapter. And Satan says, God says, have you seen my servant Job? He's righteous and blameless. He's the greatest of all the men in the east. And then Satan says to God, he says, but you've put a hedge around him. You've made him prosper. And he says, just take it away. And he says to God, he will certainly curse you to your face. And so Satan is given permission to do as he pleases to Job, but God puts a limit on him and says, but don't touch his life. And so he can't do that. And then there's that terrible passage where a servant comes into Job while he's minding his business one day. And he says, your oxen and your female donkeys were ploughing and your servants were there, and the Sabaeans mounted a raid, killed them all, took away the oxen and the donkeys, and I alone have escaped to tell you. And then while he's still speaking, another servant shows up and says, well, actually, he says, there was a great fire from heaven that came down and it killed all of your camels and all of the servants, and I alone have escaped to tell you. And then another guy comes while he's still speaking. He says, well, actually, the Chaldeans formed 3 units and they mounted a raid and they took away all your sheep, killed all the servants, and I alone have escaped to tell you. And while he's still speaking, another guy shows up and says, well, actually, there was this great cyclone that just suddenly blew across the plain, knocked down the house of your oldest son, and now all your 10 kids are dead. And I alone have escaped to tell you. And here's the interesting thing. Job faced all of that when he wasn't in control. Who was in control, though, if Job wasn't in control? Behind Job's calamity were the Chaldeans, the Sabaeans, the cyclone, and the fire. And behind the Chaldeans, the Sabaeans, the cyclone, and the fire was who? Satan. Right? There's a lesson here in that Satan does, in fact, have great power. The forces of evil are real, and they are very great, even on a national, even on a global scale. Now, a lot of people turn around at this point and say, well, you just said Satan and evil, you're a kook. I actually there was a tweet while I was on Q&A saying that because I used the word evil, and someone said, this is the language of a terrorist. But here's the simple reality. We all believe this. I mean, why is it that so much of the secular progressive mantra at the moment is systemic oppression, systemic racism, systemic? Well, because they believe in systems of evil, right? Simple. Now, it's the wrong system. And also they underestimate human evil and our own capacity for evil, and that's the revelation the Christian has, is that their own heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? Well, thankfully Jesus is here. That systemic problem, that reality is a real thing. And it is all through the Bible, the warnings. In 1 John 5:19 it says the whole world lies in the evil one. In other words, there is unseen supernatural power that fights for control. Ephesians 6:12 says, for our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world forces of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. I was in Shanghai a while ago, about 10 years ago. That's interesting, by the way. In Shanghai, I'm not just a tall man. I'm the giant straight out of the fairy tale. And it was a very interesting experience. But I was in a clothing store in Shanghai. And I was there I was just killing time. And I was just walking around. And I saw a bloke come out from between the clothes, just sort of emerge and walk off. And I thought to myself, oh, there must be a back room in this clothing store, because in that part of the world, there is always a back room with the good stuff, right? And if you do something like you pick up the handbag and you just start testing the zip, they'll stop you and say, come out the back. Let's have a look at the good stuff. That's a tip, by the way. You're welcome. Anyway, I decided to barge my way through. And I walked out the back and I realized I wasn't in the clothing store anymore. Let's say I was in an establishment of ill repute. And lucky I wasn't the MD of the ACL and no one was there with a camera at the time. That could have gone very bad. But anyway, I hightailed it out of there. I thought, oh, this is not where I want to be, and I left. But it was interesting, I realized that clothing store was a front for something else. And we're familiar with the concept of a front. You may have a business that's actually a front for some kind of money laundering process. That happens sometimes. There's always the mystery as to how it survives. Well, money laundering, and so on. And that's why we have organised crime people and all the rest of it to sort out that stuff. It's true, often the powers of this world are a front for the powers of evil. I knew that when I first moved to Canberra 7 years ago. Canberra's a certain kind of place. It's the most irreligious city in the country. It can't be a mistake. Also, it all bubbled to the surface, the trouble they have in Parliament with the girl that was raped in the minister's office, and that came out of the national press, and then all this other stuff started to bubble to the surface, all the dark underbelly of Parliament House and what happens there. I tell you, we all have known for a long time, it's not just true, it's barely scratching the surface. And there is a fight. There is always a grappling at the level of power for control. And we see that in Job's story. But here's the thing. Whilst behind Job's fire, cyclone, Sabaeans, Chaldeans is Satan, who's behind Satan? Hey, quick answer. I like that. In Bunbury, they were waiting for ages. You guys are sharp up here. And that at first, by the way, I don't know if I've tapped into any sort of rivalries, but anyway. By the way, that is at first confronting. But actually, it brings peace for the Christian. Because if that is true, remember God said to Satan, you can't go any further than X, and he could not. End of story. He was only allowed to do what he was permitted to do. Genesis 50:20 is remarkable on this. Joseph, at the end of his life, after all the suffering he went through, after being carried off into slavery into Egypt, what did Joseph say? He said to his brothers, what you meant for evil, selling me into slavery, what you meant for evil, God used for good. In other words, evil will never serve evil's ends. It will always be brought into submission. It will always be brought to heel to serve God's ends. I mean, the ultimate example of this, as I said in Perth, is actually that the darkest moment of human history, as we Christians know it, is the crucifixion of Christ. And that was the moment in which the forces of evil appeared to have the greatest victory of all. And yet it was actually the moment in which God himself generated the greatest blessing that the cosmos has ever known. Now, that is the sort of God we trust in the face of challenging times. Good will come. Good will come. And if this is being allowed to happen, these things that challenge us and perplex us, there's a reason. They are being allowed to happen, right? We believe that because we pray, right? And so when we've got our eyes closed praying, we believe that. But some people open their eyes and forget it. He's in control. And you say, well, why is it happening? What is the reason? Well, I haven't got a clue. And that's okay, because do you know what? Job didn't have a clue either. Do you know how the book opens and we get this sort of behind-the-curtain peek at what's going on? Job never got it. Read the book. He never figured it out. He just had to deal with what happened. And he sort of said in the pit of his despair, why in the world is this happening to me? Of course, the correct answer to Job's question is no. It's the wrong question. Because the reason wasn't even in this world. The reason was in another realm. Jesus said before he ascended, he said, it is not given to you to know the times or the seasons that the Father has set by his own authority. There's things we can't know and don't know. They're in another realm. It's according to another plan. And Job was in that situation. And a lot of people get very angry about that. I did a segment recently on the truth of it about deconverters. People who were Christians and then decide they're not Christians and give the reasons why. And in each case, one of the key themes was, God doesn't do it my way. God doesn't tell me what I want to know. What's the origin of evil? Well, that's the fact. We're not told, are we? I think deliberately not told. I mean, what makes us think we'd understand the answer? Because we're not God. We didn't exist. Humans weren't even made when evil came into the world. I mean, the serpent showed up, right? He was already there. We don't know how that happened. I mean, people say, well, why doesn't God cure all the cancer in the world? Well, I don't know. I'm not God. All I know is the cancer in the world will be cured in good time. It's promised that it will be cured. And actually, all the bad that happens now will be brought into submission to good one day. And praise God, as a Christian, we'll get to see it. I don't know the mysteries. I don't know. And every single person, Christian or not, lives with mysteries and unknowns and whys. Everyone says, why in the world? The reality is the Christian understands why, because there are mysteries, because there's something that's above us. We're of the dust. We're creatures. And you say, well then, in Job's case, if he didn't know and he couldn't know, what ultimately was the answer? Well, actually, in Job's case, the answer came when he didn't want the answer anymore. Isn't that interesting? He gets to the end of his life, he gets to the end of his praying and crying out to God for chapters, and then God shows up, which is no small thing. It doesn't happen very often. Shows up, well, I mean, literally happened in that way. 77 questions he throws at Job. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. And Job cannot answer any one of them. Can't have a hope of answering any one of them. Because God is saying to him, I'm God. Do you know this? Do you know that? Were you there when I laid the foundations of the world? Were you there when this? Do you understand this? And Job finishes by putting his hand on his mouth and saying, I have no questions anymore. He doesn't want his questions answered. Why? Because he realizes that his trust is not misplaced. He says, though he slay me, I will trust him. That's an incredible statement. Because he sees who has the power, he sees who has the wisdom, and he sees who's got the plan. And he says, my trust is not misplaced. But there was a point to Job, good did come. The book of Job for a start. How many people has that blessed throughout the ages? What an incredible tool has that been in the arsenal of God for people who are struggling with faith and all the rest of it? How many people have read Job 19? I know my Redeemer lives, and he shall stand, and I will meet him, and my eyes will behold him, and not another. I mean, that's New Testament theology. How many people have read that and been converted? A lot. I actually know a guy. No, a lot of people. Did Job see that? No, he didn't. But it was done. Good came. Good came. But here's the point I want to make. Job's resolution came when he was at peace. When he was at peace. And the first thing we need to understand is that for these things that are out of our control, we must have and we can have peace in the face of them. So a lot of people, I don't know if you've been on Facebook lately, it's pretty tense in there. There's a lot of it is COVID, but there's a lot of argumentation, there's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of unrest. And I work in politics, and I meet a lot of people who don't laugh anymore. I always say to people, if I stop laughing, tell me, because I'll quit. It's time to go. It's defeated me. But here's the reality, right? Why are these things happening? Well, I know that behind it all is the permission of God, and it can only go so far. And it only ever does go so far, by the way. You see the world go almost to the brink. You saw that in like the world wars and stuff. It goes to the brink, and then it comes back. It goes to the brink, and then it comes back. All the time. God's behind it all, so we trust it. And even though we don't know the answer, we know that there is an answer. And we know that our trust is not misplaced. Now that gives you great hope. That gives you great peace. Here's the other thing it'll do for us, not just give us peace in the face of those things, but secondly, it will make us pray. It will help us not to get too big for our boots and think we can control more than we can. Rather, we will realize that there is somebody who is in control, and for whatever reason, this is another mystery, he prescribes prayer as a means of changing things. I don't know why, but he does. I don't know why he even bothers to need us, but he does. He says, pray, and things will change. You know that verse that everyone talks about, if my people will humble themselves and pray, I will hear from heaven, I will heal their land. What's the key word? If. If. And I look at what's going on in the world at the moment, and I think if that doesn't drive the people of God to prayer, nothing will. Nothing. Oh, there you go. That's for emphasis. Nothing will. A providential mic drop. I often say in my talks, I say the story of the Bible is actually the world going to custard and God picking someone to raise up and fix it. You see that just time and again. And it's always someone who walks before him blameless, who's of good condition of heart, who we can use, someone who's available. But what I miss out sometimes is that very often it's preceded by a prayer. You think of someone like Nehemiah, looking at the ruins of Jerusalem and the state of the temple of God. He prayed. Took a while, but God answered his prayer. And blow me down, sometimes he does. And you can see things you prayed for years ago happen, and you go, whoo, there you go. I've seen that so much of that. Sometimes you can pray for something. I've prayed for things mid-meeting, and you watch it. You watch the person in front of you. It's incredible. God does answer prayer. And we would be more prayerful people. You look at someone like Hannah in the Bible. Samuel, raised up to deliver God's people. How? The prayer of his mum. Incredible stuff. We should be people who pray and we should be people who are at peace with those things we cannot control. Let me, much more briefly, for there will be no time for Q&A otherwise. We did start late, didn't we? That's my excuse. I want to quickly make just a few comments about things we can control. Things we can do. I mean, there are things we can do already, but there's a little bit more. And I want to make this particularly in relation to issues where, I'm going to say issues where there's an issue of righteousness in your personal life, if I could put it that way. What do I mean? Well, think of the Christian parent who is facing the conversion therapy law in Victoria. What are they going to do? Think of the pastor who is preaching and he hits Romans 1. What's he going to do? Jump to Romans 2? You know, there's something to be said there. Or what about the Christian citizen who faces the state in a range of areas like we just described? What about the Christian employee facing HR? And my goodness, we've basically got a hotline for people like that, ringing up saying, help, I've just said something in the lunchroom and HR's onto me. What about those people? Well, you know, Jesus thought about this before you did. And he said something. Do you know, when I finished that opening thing, we joked about how sad we were? What did Jesus say? Blessed are the persecuted for righteousness' sake. In other words, he said there's a blessing here. Chin up. There's a blessing here. And he doesn't say psych yourself up and you might find a blessing. He says there is a blessing. And he says, rejoice and be glad, for great is your reward in heaven. And I want to say first and foremost, your decision in these crisis moments, it must be defined not by the day on which it happens, but it must be defined by the next life. That's where your anchor post should be. That's where your decision-making paradigm needs to be. It needs to be in the next life, the well done, good and faithful servant life. There. The not treasures on earth, treasures in heaven life. What Jesus said about treasures on earth, they're a lot of fun to build up, right? But the moths eat them, the rust rusts them, the thieves break in and steal them, and then they're all gone when you die anyway. And he says, well, treasure in heaven lasts. Now that should be our decision-making paradigm. A lot of people, they cop out. A lot of people fold. You know, we're going to have to get tough as Christians. We really are. A good spoonful of concrete and harden up. Because it's not getting any easier, right? And that's something, you know, I was going to say, pray for courage. But I did make the mistake of doing that once. And unfortunately, if you pray for courage, that might be a prayer that gets answered. Because it doesn't come by magic. That's the hint. We need to be tough, and we need to make sure that that is our frame of reference. And I find it sad to see so many Christians with a frame of reference that's too close to the here and now, that's driving their decisions. Some people say, Martyn, persecution, that's over by egging it. Don't be ridiculous. No one's getting fed to the lions. I appreciate that. But Jesus does go on to say, blessed are you when you're reviled, when people are angrily disgusted with you, when they insult you, when they speak evil against you for my name's sake. I think he is thinking about these things. I mean, homophobe, bigot, hater. I mean, the reason these things vex us is because they're just so not true. And you make the mistake sometimes of sitting down and going, well, is it true? And you sort of worry about it, and you realize it's not true. It's just not true. Yeah. Well, I think Jesus is thinking about these sorts of things. That's what people will think of you, because they don't see the truth about you. It is a feature, not a bug, in the Christian life. Jesus thought this would be situation normal. It's very clear in John's Gospel in particular. A lot of young people come to our download program, and the thing pressing on their mind is, at university, if I say what I believe, people don't like me. If I come out as a Christian in this workplace, it's really challenging. I mean, that is the paradigm under which they're living, because they're just going out into the world, 18 to 25-year-olds, and they just face it and realize how tough it is. And they say, well, how can I say things? How can I act in a way that people will like? In a way that people will be endeared to? Well, I've got to say, ultimately, it's a losing battle. Ultimately, it will be for righteousness' sake. Someone will still always be upset. Don't be a jerk, be nice. But someone will always be upset. It's not how you say it, it's what you're saying. It's a feature, not a bug in the Christian life. 2 things to do. The first one is salt. That's how he goes on. You're the salt of the earth. He says you're the light of the world. The salt, that is something, he says, don't lose your taste. What's that mean? Salt that loses its taste is salt for which the moisture has got into it. In other words, the environment that it's sitting in has compromised it. Don't let your environment compromise you. That begins with making the right decision on the right day. Daniel did that. Daniel didn't think he could plan his life and his future better than God could. He decided he would do the right thing today and let God take care of the rest. We need to live like that more and more. He didn't compromise even in Babylon when the standards and pressures of Babylon were on him. He was an amazing example. In fact, Daniel's a more and more relevant book because we're living in a less and less Christian society. So we need to look, we're living in more and more Babylonian society. We need to look at his life. He didn't compromise. The other point I'll make is it doesn't just relate to your external actions, it relates to your internal Christianity. We need to be people who are serious about holiness, serious about modelling Jesus Christ, serious about getting sin out of our lives. I think often our standards get sloppy because, salt preserves the putrefying stuff, and the world is a bit putrid sometimes. The things that are on our screens in our lounge rooms, things that are broadcasting through our televisions, the stuff we're getting used to, the stuff we're allowing to change our approach and our outlook and our thinking. We need to get serious about that. Revival and judgment begin in God's house. And if we want to change the world, we need to be salty. We can't be compromised. And if we want that salt to shine light, which is the next thing, well, it's got to have integrity. And it begins in the heart. It begins in the heart. And if you are salty, if your mere existence is a preserving effect on this world because you're a non-compromised Christian, then you can also be light. And the point of the light is don't hide it under the basket. It should be visible. I'll say one thing about our LGBT friends outside, which they've absolutely nailed brilliantly. Visibility, right? Visibility. Everybody has a friend from the LGBT community. But when you do the surveys, people think they don't have friends in the Christian community. And they do. There's a lot of Christians in this country. A lot. Visibility. Find ways to be visible. I heard a pastor the other day say you should introduce yourself as a Christian. Now, I don't mean in an awkward, stupid way, like I'm Martyn and I'm a Christian straight up. But I mean, it should, well, you could. Try it sometime. Who knows? You just don't know. You've got to create opportunities sometimes. I'm serious. Pray for them. Make them. But it should be something about you that's immediately obvious. You shouldn't be in a workplace where you're not known for your faith. You shouldn't be in a university where you're not known for your faith. It'll help you when you get trouble down the line, by the way, because you'll have the relationship built on the right basis. But also, if people see the light, they can be drawn to the light. The challenge, of course, is if the light is on, if you're seen, you need to back it up with action. I saw a great quote, actually. Out of 100 people, 99 will read the Bible. 1 will read the Bible, 99 will read the Christian. That's who we've got to be. And then this whole section finishes with this conclusion. Jesus says, people will see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. In other words, you were under pressure, weren't you? Persecuted for righteousness' sake. Now who's under pressure? All of a sudden, the light is on. The salt is salty. The persecution didn't do the job. And what you're doing now is you are visible and people are seeing your good works and glorifying God. Let me make this point. Very often, the anger and the opposition will be very loud. Very often, we can be deceived into thinking that's all there is, and it discourages us. Now, I've been there. My office got car bombed a few years ago. Very often, the anger and the opposition is very loud and in your face, and you think, well, it's not working, what's the point? But if you persevere long enough, you just find out that actually God does use these things, usually in a quiet way, in a subtle way. And going around the country for this Truth of It Live tour has been amazing because I've met so many people who say my life has been changed through the content, who say I've been converted because I first encountered a Truth of It video, and you look at the impact and the effect over time, quietly in the background, you say, praise God, He is at work in the world, and praise God, the light does work and the salt does work. Of course it does. Jesus promised that it would. And that's got to be our final destination in all that we do. We must never forget that ultimately we're drawing people to Christ and we're seeking to glorify God. We are in politics, we are in workplaces, but ultimately the final destination that God wills for every human being is Christ and His salvation. Let's always have that in the back of our mind whenever we act. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm over time, but I'm Martyn Iles. That was the truth of it. Also, I forgot to do this.